Hey there, Larry.
Hey Glenn, how you doing?
Doing okay. Welcome to the Glenn Show. This is Glenn Loury at Brown University, and I'm very happy to have in conversation this afternoon Laurence Kotlikoff, professor of economics at Boston University, and fiscal hawk extraordinaire, if I read your recent Bloomberg column correctly. Larry, we are here today to talk about economic policy, budget woes, fiscal gap, and short run versus long run, and in particular to talk about what you think are the inadequacies and the ways in which some serious people, at least previously thought to be serious, are discussing this issue. So I'm wondering if we could start with you just reprising a little bit what it is that you're saying in your Bloomberg piece.
Well, it's actually a Yahoo piece that's coming out probably today or tomorrow.
Okay, thanks for the correction. Let us know exactly what the piece is. It's at Yahoo?
Yeah, it's yahoo.com. It's I think I'm not sure what they're going to title it, but the tentative title is Krugman's Four Fiscal Fables.
Well, by the time anybody sees this blogging heads, it will already have been posted at the Yahoo site. And I just want to recommend to our viewers that if they're at all interested in understanding the foundations of this debate about taxes and spending over the long term and the threat posed to future generations by our fiscal profligacy, then they, whatever their party, ought to read your column. Definitely ought to read your column. But why don't you start by telling us what this Yahoo column is basically saying?
Sure, Glenn. You refer to me as a fiscal hawk, but I like to think of myself as just a grown-up and an adult. And the definition of a grown-up, an adult, is that he takes care of his children. That's the first responsibility of a grown-up. And so I think these labels of people as, hawk or dove, generally are not all that useful, because it may turn off people and have them stop listening. But economic science doesn't have hawks or doves. It just has its own content, and it tells us certain things, and it tells us how to think about certain things, how to look at economic policy. And it says very clearly that the way we need to look at the long-term fiscal policy of our country is in terms of not what the government says are the official debts of the country, but what the entire policy entails in terms of all the obligations. So our government, through time, for the last 6 decades, has run a massive Ponzi scheme, taking from young people and giving to old people, and putting huge obligations on those on the kids to pay for the pension and health care benefits of you and me and all the 40 million current retirees.
May we live forever.
Yeah, may we all live forever, and we're 78 million baby boomers large. Now, all those obligations to pay your benefits and my benefits when we ultimately retire, they're not on the books. My 93-year-old mother, her Social Security check that comes in every month, that's an obligation to pay a benefit that's not on the books.
Yeah.
All the defense spending for the people in the military, next year, the year after, into the future, not on the books. So virtually all the obligations that the government really has to pay are not on the books. And they've arranged this, Congress and the presidents have arranged this to make the official debt very small. The ones that are on the books are called the official debt. These are the value in the present of all the future interest and principal payments, but the value in the present of all the Social Security payments are not on the books, the Medicare payments, the Medicaid payments, the payments to gas up Air Force One.
Okay, Larry, let me stop you for a minute. I got that, but I want to make sure that I and listeners understand fully. Now, you're saying that the government has made commitments to do things in the future which will cost, but those costs are nowhere reflected in present-day accounting numbers about the government's budgetary situation, those promises that will necessarily be kept and that will be expensive, but they are not entered into anybody's bookkeeping entry just yet. But so I've got that part right. But now, how is the government acting in a way to hide? What is it doing intentionally to avoid having those costs show up? How might it otherwise write its budget in order that those costs would be made
it's very
clear
simple
to us?
I mean, think about
Yes.
Social Security. This year, you're paying payroll taxes, right?
Right.
You're making Social Security contributions, social insurance contributions. The government is calling those taxes, but it could also call the money it takes from you borrowing. And then the benefits that it's promising to pay you back in the future could say, well, look, they're not transfer payments, they're return of principal plus interest on that borrowing that we're doing today.
In which case, those collections from me would be regarded as adding to the, quote, debt, close quote, of the government, if the government classified the taxes and Social Security that it collects from me as borrowing from me because it knows it has to pay me back later.
Yes, exactly. So how we label receipts and payments it will produce whatever deficit and time path of the stock of debt the government wants to report. So regardless of what the underlying fiscal policy is, what the government's actually doing in terms of taking from some people and giving to other people, or how much it's actually consuming, it can be labeled in such a way as to produce a time path of debt that's either rising through time, falling through time, going up or down from one day to the next. So the language, the choice of language means that the debt is not really a well-defined measure of anything. We should stop looking at the official debt as a measure of our fiscal policy. Any really first-rate economist, and Paul Krugman is certainly supposed to be a first-rate economist, would know this. I've certainly been writing about this and speaking about it publicly for 40 years.
Okay. So I'm sorry to interrupt. I know our time is short, though, Larry. You've told me that you only have a small amount of time, so I want to.
Yeah.
So point number one is we've got the wrong measure of the problem. What's being called debt by the government is arbitrary. What really matters is the relationship of promises to pay out by the government and resources anticipated to come in by the government over the entire horizon of the government's operation, which goes ahead generations.
Yes, absolutely. So that, and actually what's long run versus short run can't be distinguished in terms, but economic science can't tell us what's the long run and what's the short run. We just have a path of policy, and that's, and it's either sustainable or not. Now, our path of policy that we're on entails a fiscal gap, a gap between all the spending in the future and all the taxes of, get this, $222 trillion.
I saw that in your piece, and it really blew me away.
Right.
Just to put this in perspective, the GDP of the annual income of the country is what, 16 trillion, something like that per year?
Yeah, that's right, exactly. So this is many times GDP.
We're talking more than 10 times a year's income is the gap between what our government has promised to do and what resources appear to be available to our government over the long haul.
Yeah, it's about 15 years of GDP is what we're short. That's the magnitude of the problem. So we're not, when Krugman writes about the debt and the deficit, he's writing about a molehill, not the mountain of obligations. And he says that the things I'm talking about, worried about, are coming in the future, but that's only a result of the way we do the fiscal labeling. If we use different words, we would see huge debts in the present, huge official debts, and he would be writing columns about how big a problem there is with respect to the official debt. So he's subject to deficit delusion. He's not seeing the true picture, and therefore, he's writing these columns week after week that says we should spend more and we should presumably not raise taxes either and not worry about the official debt, while he's ignoring the fact that the unofficial debt is getting bigger, and it's getting bigger in large part because the payments as they've been classified are getting closer and closer to coming due. For example, you and I, Glenn.
I know, our generation, yeah.
Right, getting closer to retirement.
We're going to start getting Medicare benefits pretty soon, Larry, and a whole lot of others with us. But just to be fair, Krugman is not the only person who thinks that keeping our eye on the deficit is the thing to think about. He keeps his eye on the deficit and says it doesn't matter because he wants to promote more employment with stimulus spending. And conservatives keep their eye on the deficit, saying the deficit is so big, Obama has added so much to the deficit since his presidency, we're bankrupting our children, which is not all that different from what you're saying, except their eye is focused on the same delusionary measure of the government's fiscal conditions.
Well, here's the deal, Glenn. When you have somebody who's, let's say, a maintenance worker or a stewardess or whatever, a job that's not a professional economist, you can expect them to systematically say the wrong thing about the economy and about economic science. But when you have somebody who's got a Nobel Prize in economics, and it's not just Krugman, when you have somebody like Glenn Hubbard, who's a guy
Dean of the Business School at Columbia University and former advisor to George W. Bush.
Right. When he doesn't talk about the fiscal gap, when he doesn't get, he was the chief economic advisor to Mitt Romney, when he doesn't get Romney to mention the fiscal gap once in the entire campaign, when President Obama isn't mentioning the fiscal gap ever. He had Larry Summers, the former Secretary of Treasury, also presumably a top economist. When these top economists are not telling the politicians the truth and aren't talking about economic policy, fiscal policy in terms that are not arbitrary and in terms that are meaningful, then we got a big problem.
Okay, Larry, what do you say to the... Now, every time I turn on one of these Sunday shows and a politician comes on, especially from the left, and this issue of fiscal gap is raised, although perhaps not in those words, but people are saying we're unsustainable, our path is unsustainable over long. People will say in response to that, Social Security is good for another 25 or 35 years, the trust fund, this and that. Don't talk to me about Social Security. They may acknowledge as how the path of increasing medical costs and Medicare obligations do constitute a problem, but they don't want to talk about pushing the age back to eligibility of Medicare, any kind of structural reform. So a lot of people are saying fiscal gap be damned. There isn't any crisis facing our social insurance programs, especially Social Security, in the immediate. And we've got an unemployment problem that's very serious. What's wrong with you? We run the deficits we need to run now in order to pump up the economy, and we fix Social Security over the next quarter century, and we deal with Medicare sooner than that, but we can deal with all of this stuff. What do you say to those people?
Well, I think they should look at Table 4B6 in the Social Security Trustees Report. That shows the infinite horizon fiscal gap just for Social Security. And by the way, what you call Social Security versus non-Social Security programs is also completely arbitrary. But if you take the Social Security system by itself and assume there's nothing else going on in the government, and you look at Table 4B6 of the last Trustees Report, you'll see that it's 31% underfinanced, underfunded. It's in the worst.
Over what horizon, Larry? Excuse me, over what?
Horizon, the infinite horizon. That's
okay, going out forever, okay.
And that's the only horizon under which these measures actually have any meaning, that these measures are label-free. And so it's very important to go out to the infinite horizon because everything else is subject to this labeling problem.
That is, they can do stuff to push the obligations off beyond the end of whatever finite horizon one might stipulate.
Exactly. And so when Greenspan fixed the Social Security system back in 1983 with his set of politicians, they decided to look at the 75-year fiscal gap in Social Security rather than the infinite horizon fiscal gap. So they knew back then that they were going to leave us in a situation today where we're looking at the current 75-year projection window where we now include I think something like 30 years that they ignored. So so they knew they were ignoring a big problem, and we're now facing it. And as a result, Social Security is in worse shape than ever before they, quote, fixed it. So the moral of the story is you don't want Alan Greenspan touching anything when it comes to fixing policy.
Well, I didn't need Kotlikoff to tell me that, but I'll accept that. I mean, the moral of the story is you want somebody who knows what they're doing and deals with the reality. I mean, I thought you were going to define adulthood, not mainly in terms of caring about our kids, but also in terms about coming to grips with reality and not living in a world of fantasy.
Yeah, we don't need political.
So we don't want people who live in a world of fantasy.
Not political economists.
Okay. We need real economists. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm for that.
We need you, Glenn, down in Washington.
Well, we need you, Larry. Fiscal gaps is not my thing, man. I deal with inequality and microeconomic theory and such.
Well,
but we need people who know what they're doing.
You're one of the top economists in the world, and you would get this straight. You get this straight in 10 seconds. So you've gotten this straight. So
Okay, so thank you. I appreciate the praise, audience. Note well. But Larry,
Yeah.
what about Paul Krugman? He's got a Nobel Prize. Paul Krugman, MIT. Paul Krugman, Fundamental Contributions to International Trade Theory. Last time I looked, Paul Krugman was a pretty serious economist. So, it's not a question of IQ.
Well, I think it's a question of politics here. I think he's using his position in the New York Times to get across his political view. And in his mind, everything's the rich against the poor, the left against the right. But what we really have here is an ongoing war of older people against younger people, a systematic expropriation of the young through time. That's the moral dilemma of our day. That's the moral problem. And that's what all adults, all grown-ups need to start recognizing what we've done to our kids. We're not only leaving them a terrible fiscal situation and a really bad economy, thanks to the way we've organized our banking system, but we're also leaving them a climate that's, it's very dangerous.
Yeah.
So, what do we really value in the world? Is it our kids or not? I mean, if we're mostly concerned about ourselves, then we'll just keep on doing what we're doing. But our job as economists is to make it clear what we're doing.
Okay. Our job as social scientists is to be clear and transparent about the actual functioning of the world in which we're embedded, not to make value judgments about what's moral or what the relative morality of various alternative courses of action are. That's a job for politics. And I just wanted to underscore something you said a moment ago that I think is very important. The equity argument in our politics is generally cast in intra-generational terms. Here are the rich, here is the middle class,
Right.
and maybe there are the poor. But here are the rich, and here is the middle class. But what you just said is that perhaps by an order of magnitude, more fundamental equity problem is that between generations currently alive today who can do things that will affect the welfare of generations as yet unborn. And the thing that is so deeply interesting about that to me is that generations as yet unborn don't vote.
Yeah,
But the middle class does.
Right.
Okay?
So
Generations as yet unborn do not determine.
Representation. We have misrepresentation because we're using phony numbers to describe how we're treating our kids. So, it's...
Now, pardon me for feeling that that's a conservative argument. I know that you're not a conservative, and I really wish you would address this, to say we're expropriating our children by not balancing our books and by spending without restraint and without being willing to pay for what we want to spend. The moral thing to do is to get our...
I never learned that caring about your kids was the purview of conservatives or Republicans or libertarians. I thought Democrats, that everybody's equally interested in their children.
But do you disagree with me in terms of how the narrative that is suggested by your concern fits into the contemporary landscape of political rhetoric? I mean, I'm just making an observation. I wasn't trying to accuse you of anything. I said it sounds like a conservative argument.
I know that whenever anybody starts talking about taking care of the next generation, they assume that person doesn't care about inequality within a cohort. But right. I certainly do. I put forth explicit tax reform proposals, Social Security reform proposals that actually would make things more progressive. I think we have a lot of inequality within cohort, but we're also producing enormous inequality across cohorts. Yeah. You have the situation of poor young people transferring resources to Warren Buffett. That's what we've got going on in a nutshell here. So
okay, I want to talk about two more delusions, and then I want to get your suggestions about what we do. The delusions I want to talk about are, if we cut taxes, that'll stimulate economic growth, and that's the way to deal with the budget problem. That's delusion number one, call it supply-side economics. Delusion number two is, if we would just invest in infrastructure and other kinds of spending, we would both restore the economy to full employment and we would lay the foundation for future growth. That's the idea that spending is a way of actually increasing our tax revenues and, over the longer term, reducing our budget problems. You say in your column that both views, both the supply side economics view and the hyper Keynesian, we can spend our way out of a recession and invest our way to high growth, are wrong. And I wonder if you could expand on that.
Well, here's the thing. There's not a very firm empirical basis for this when you look at it carefully. I know some people like Larry Summers think this is a real thing, but what we're talking about here is cutting people's taxes and praying that that's going to generate enough activity in the economy to have more revenue at the end of the day, or increasing spending and assuming the same thing will happen. So we've got just supply side crazies and we've got demand side crazies. And I would put Krugman in the demand side crazy along with Summer category, and Glenn Hubbard in the supply side crazy category. Now, along with Art Laffer. Now, our kids can't afford taking these kinds of risks with their futures. So, and the other thing is that even under the best of circumstances, if we could just snap our fingers and get back to full employment, then what we're talking about is 5% of GDP for 4 or 5 years, because the CBO is projecting that we're going to get back to full employment even without any additional changes in fiscal policy. But if you look...
Within 4 years.
Yeah, within 4 years.
Yeah.
But then if you ask what is needed to get our fiscal gap to zero, it turns out it's about 11% of GDP from now till the end of time. So we might get 2% of GDP out of snapping our fingers, out of this magic that Krugman and others think could happen. But we're not going to get 11% of GDP. We're going to be short another 9% of GDP over the next 4 or 5 years, and then we're going to be short 11% of GDP thereafter. So we have an enormous problem. Yeah.
I got to stop you because the audience are not economists.
Okay.
What you just said is, A, in order to close the fiscal gap, we would need to set aside 11% of national income every year forever, in order to meet our obligations. That means we're actually 11% poor.
This Congressional Budget Office's alternative fiscal scenario projection. They put it out every June, and I'm trying to incorporate what's likely to be the case as a result of this most recent change in fiscal policy, the tax hike and the sequestration.
Thanks for the explanation, Larry. I just want to underscore the meaning of what you're saying for people who may not be experts. We are actually 11% poorer than we appear to be, because 11% of our income needs to be put into a side account forever in order to accommodate the difference between what we promised to spend through our government and what we are committed to collect in terms of taxes by our government. That's an astounding fact. But once we have that fact on board, then it's easy to see that ending a recession that might go on at most for another 4 or 5 years, and that by ending it would contribute 2 or 3 or 4% more GDP than otherwise would have gotten, will do nothing meaningful to address the long-term budgetary imbalance of the government. So we can't spend our way out of this problem.
No, we can't spend our way out, and we can't cut taxes out of it. And so we have to get serious, and we have to have real structural reforms. And I'm all for investing in infrastructure. I'm not saying we don't need to have government. Nobody should confuse me with a libertarian or a Ron Paul. That would be crazy if they read anything I've written.
Okay, although we're going to get to monetary policy in a moment, Larry, in the last part of our conversation, when such confusion might yet arise.
Sure, okay.
Okay, but go on. You're not against government. You're just in favor of paying for what we're going to do so we don't burden our children.
Yeah, Glenn, I just missed you the last sentence there. Just give me that again.
I just summed up. You're not against government. You just want us to pay our way so that we don't burden our kids.
Yeah, and we need to do what we're trying to do much more efficiently and productively. We need to have, all kinds of fundamental reforms, taxes, Social Security, health care, that really will work for everybody, and also banking and energy policy, so education policy. There are things that economists who are not from the left or the right can actually add to this country's policy that we're just not being consulted because we have these self-declared experts who are getting all the attention, and they're getting the attention because they're saying extreme things and extremely stupid things and dangerous things.
Okay, now we don't have time to go over the entire portfolio of policy suggestions Larry, but I know that if anyone goes to your website, they will find information there and links there that will inform them what you think should be done about tax policy, about healthcare policy, and so on. And so where is your website, Larry?
Well, it's kotlikoff.net, and then there's another site called thepurpleplans.org, thepurpleplans.org.
One word, thepurpleplans.org.
Yeah,
and kotlikoff.net.
And if
okay,
people
so
like
since
them, they can endorse the policies online there.
Okay, thanks for that. Now, finally, then, since I know your time is limited, let's talk a little bit about running the monetary printing press, which people have said, including Paul Krugman, if you got to do it, and Ben Bernanke, chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, have said, well, we're in a recession. Well, unemployment is high, been high for a long time. A lot of people, long-term unemployed, new people coming into the labor force, not finding work, and so forth and so on. Quantitative easing too, which means let's run the printing press, and not just in this country, but in many countries around the world. Now, in your recent column, you object strenuously to this, as have others, including Ron Paul, I might add. But as have others, saying inflation is right around the corner. Indeed, hyperinflation is right around the corner. Krugman poo-poos that, saying in effect, oh, the inflation boogeyman, where's the inflation? It hasn't come yet. The bond market vigilantes, where's the bond market? It hasn't gone haywire on us yet. Right. You differ, and I'd like you to explain to people how you differ.
He sounds like a stockbroker in 1999 saying that .com stocks are never going to crash, or a guy in 2007 saying subprimes are the hottest thing in the world. He's buying at the top of the market. So I think he should load up his portfolio in 30-year government bonds. That's what he should do, and he should disclose that online.
While you and I sell those bad boys short.
He leaves this crap that he's saying.
Maybe he can buy them from us, Larry.
What?
I said we can sell them short. Maybe he can buy them from us.
Yeah, that's right. When you triple the monetary base, here's what the Federal Reserve has done since 2007. It has tripled. It's engaged in an experiment in monetary policy that's unheard of in this history of this country, or really any country, except for Europe and the Bank of England and Japan over the same period, which have really followed suit. But what he's done is he's tripled the amount of money that the government has printed. So we have in place the basis for a tripling of the price level for hyperinflation. That's already what's happened up till this day. And now Bernanke, who is a friend of mine and I respect his research, he's increasing the money supply, the base money supply, by $85 billion a month. So now he thinks he can keep control of this process. If inflation takes off, he thinks he has ways.
He'll pull the reins back if things seem to be getting out of control.
Right. But if you look historically, like just look at the last century, when you had 20 countries having hyperinflations, it was because they had fiscal policies in those countries that were out of control. And the government was just printing money to pay its bills. And that's exactly what we're doing. We're just printing money to pay our bills. And Ben Bernanke can say whatever he wants about that, but that's actually the reality. 12 cents out of every dollar the government's spending is now just being printed out of either electronically or physically. So there's a potential here for huge, huge, huge inflation. And that's going to bite our kids again. So why are we taking this kind of risk? We're not getting anything done. The interest rates are low as could be. It hasn't turned the economy around. He's just doing more of this.
Hold on. Let me stop you for a minute.
The government's going broke. It's not turning the economy around. So let's just look at the facts.
Okay, hold on. I want to clarify something. The exact nature of the risk you're saying we're following a risky, perhaps even reckless monetary policy. A policy of expanding the monetary base, of easing to keep interest rates low in the interest of promoting employment during a recession. You're saying the monetary base has tripled since 2007, and you're saying that there's going to be a piper to be paid in this, but this piper doesn't announce his coming. We will think everything is fine until it ain't fine no more. And history teaches us that doing this eventually brings you to a point where everything ain't fine no more. So the risk that we're taking is that we're going to wake up and in a matter of a month, we're going to find ourselves unable to sell the government's bonds at any kind of reasonable price to raise money, higher interest rates, and a rising price level that's going to bring misery and impoverishment to billions of people. I mean, am I overstating it, or am I getting this right?
You're getting it right, and I'm not the only one who's saying this. Most middle-of-the-road economists, most professional economists who aren't trying to sell themselves to some politician would say this. And if you look at Bill Gross of PIMCO, he's running the largest mutual fund in the world. He's been saying this, and he even shorted bonds last year. He didn't make money; he lost money doing it, but he got out of the U.S. bond market because he saw this problem coming. Now, when exactly it's going to come, nobody can say. If enough people keep reading enough Paul Krugman columns, this could go on for several years the way it is. But when you have this much money sloshing around and the banks are sitting on huge amounts of excess reserves, which they can start lending out at a moment's notice, you should, at least historically, we've seen high inflation be associated with very high money creation. So I don't think that anything is different in our economy just because we're a big economy and we've got this reserve currency in the world. People are going to lose their taste for dollars when they realize, it's very risky.
So do you think we're benefiting at all from the fact that while dollars may be risky and while the U.S. government's fiscal gap is unsustainable, where else are you going to put your money so that people are, all over the world are still willing to loan the U.S. government money, since as bad as things may be, it's the best bet out there?
Well, everything's risky, but I would say
that's what I mean.
There are countries that have fiscal gaps of zero, maybe even negative. Canada, Chile, Australia, New Zealand. You could buy their bonds, not U.S. Treasury bonds, which I view as nominal bonds. It's extremely risky. You can buy real estate today, which if you sit in a house, you certainly get a stream of consumption services from that. It's perfectly safe. So markets do change, and we've seen major currencies get into trouble. We saw the pound become, go from a reserve currency, the world's currency, to a second-rate currency for a while, right? Now it's a first-rate currency. So things change, and our job is just to talk about, what we know, which is we don't know exactly when they will change, but we do know as economists what the big problems are, because they're staring at us. And if we systematically ignore them or misrepresent them, misreport them, misdiscuss them, then we're doing a grave disservice to the American public, and that's what Paul Krugman's been doing.
Larry, I really appreciate you coming on the Glenn Show. You persuade me. I must say that I was already inclined in your direction when I opened up my Washington Post last week and saw Joe Scarborough and Jeffrey Sachs co-authoring a column saying, along similar lines to what you just said now, that Paul Krugman is wrong and that the country needs to address the future generations, obligations of future generations. That was Jeff Sachs, director of the Earth Institute, a liberal economist, and Joe Scarborough, former Republican congressman from Florida, host of the Morning Joe show on MSNBC, and his last time I checked, a card-carrying conservative Republican.
Yeah, so, the difference is that both of these guys are grown-ups, and they're also, Jeff's one of the world's top economists.
He is.
And somebody who cares very deeply about inequality, both across generations and within generations.
And across national boundaries, too. He's been writing a lot about global poverty stuff and environmental future generations on the, global warming and all that. So,
Take Michael Boskin, another fantastic economist. He's conservative. He's
a Republican,
First President Bush. He's been also writing the same things, raising the same concerns. So,
what is Marty Feldstein saying?
Say again?
What is former mentor of Lawrence Summers, Martin Feldstein, former chairman under Reagan of the Council of Economic Advisors, saying?
Well, I'll just say what he used to say when he was in the Reagan administration, working as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, that he was extremely concerned about obligations to future generations. He wrote path-breaking work on Social Security's unfunded liability. So Marty's said different things over time, but I would point to his long-term concern with expropriating the young. He was really the first one to put his finger on that problem back in 1974. And that's when we all started looking at the fiscal gap and coming up with these appropriate long-term measures, because Marty, he really didn't really indicate that it was a labeling problem, but it became clear that that was the problem.
Yep, that was 40 years ago, Larry, darn near.
Yeah, exactly.
All right,
Glenn.
again, we're in your debt, and carry on. You're doing good work. Thank you very much.
You're in my fiscal gap, man. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay.